Imagine Africa as this, like, vast, evolving chessboard, right?
Mhm.
And China's a really formidable player, making these moves that just ripple across the whole continent.
Mhm.
Have you ever really stopped to think about what's truly driving China's, rapidly growing presence there, and what those moves, those strategic choices, actually mean for Africa's own development path?
It's a huge question and a really important one.
Exactly. So today, we're diving deep. We're pulling back the curtain on precisely that, China's foreign policy in Africa. And we're going to take a particularly close look at how it's playing out in Nigeria.
Nigeria is a fascinating case study for this.
It really is. We're going to explore the underlying interests.
Yeah.
Are they political, economic, security related? What's really shaping Beijing's approach?
Hmm.
Then we'll pivot. We'll look at the tangible, on-the-ground impact in a country like Nigeria. We'll try to assess, with a critical eye, has this relationship genuinely spurred development? Or maybe, just maybe, has it introduced a whole new set of challenges?
Right. It's rarely black and white, is it?
Never. Our mission here, like always, is to really pull out the most important bits of knowledge, the key insights from the material we've dug into. We want to give you a clear, nuanced understanding. It's that shortcut to being truly well-informed on this, well, crucial global relationship.
Yeah. Cutting through the noise.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unearth the layers of this fascinating dynamic.
Let's do it.
So when we first started, unpacking the history of China's engagement with Africa, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that it hasn't always been this massive interconnected force we see today.
Not at all. There's been a really significant shift.
Yeah, a really interesting and frankly quite dramatic historical shift. It's moved from something that was, well, maybe somewhat ideologically driven way back when,
Hmm.
to something far more pragmatic now, almost ruthlessly pragmatic, you could say, in its modern form.
That's a good way to put it. Pragmatism is key.
So if we, cast our minds back, think
Mm.
about the time before those huge events of 1989, specifically Tiananmen Square.
Right. And placing it within that whole Cold War context.
Exactly. Back then, Africa's importance to China actually, well, it dwindled quite a bit.
It really did. China was intensely focused inward.
Totally.
Yeah.
Focused almost exclusively on its own domestic modernization.
Deng Xiaoping's agenda, right?
Yep. That meant prioritizing ties with developed countries, the U.S., Western Europe, Japan.
Because that's where the good stuff was, relatively speaking. The vital foreign investment, the advanced tech, the expertise they desperately needed to kickstart their own, industrial and economic transformation.
Uh-huh. They needed that engine for growth.
And while, sure, Chinese leaders definitely paid lip service to concepts like South-South cooperation.
You still heard the rhetoric.
Yeah, the idea of developing nations working together. And you might still hear echoes of Maui's principles in official statements sometimes. But the cold reality. Beijing's main concern was keeping close, economically beneficial ties with nations that could fuel its growth.
Economic gain became paramount.
Absolutely. That revolutionary fervor, the Maoist propaganda, it really took a backseat as Deng's socialist modernization agenda took hold. Right.
And this new plan, it demanded an approach that was, well, non-conflictual, super pragmatic, and really just focused on getting investment, not spreading ideology.
Mm-hmm.
So as a result, Africa, for a time anyway, became less central in China's big strategy.
Even the old reasons, like supporting anti-Soviet movements there.
Yeah, that largely became irrelevant as the Cold War itself started winding down.
Right. The geopolitical map was changing.
But then, 1989 happened. And for China, the global stage just shifted. Abruptly. Dramatically.
Tiananmen Square, June 4th.
Exactly. And that crackdown brought swift, harsh, repeated criticism. China's human rights record was slammed by pretty much the entire developed world.
International isolation. Sanctions followed quickly.
Beijing found itself in a really tough spot. Severe international isolation, a barrage of Western sanctions. And this is where Africa, maybe surprisingly to some, steps in, plays this really crucial, timely role.
It's a fascinating pivot point.
Think about it. Just months after the crackdown, August '89, a group of 6 southern African countries, Botswana, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Angola, Zambia, Mozambique, they stepped forward, boldly.
Right. They defied that Western consensus.
Totally. They invited the Chinese foreign minister, Qin Keqiang, to visit. And this wasn't just, a courtesy call.
No, it was a lifeline, diplomatic cover.
It really was, offering Beijing this crucial bit of legitimacy when it desperately needed to break out of that isolation.
And didn't the first head of state visit post-Tiananmen also come from Africa?
You got it. The very first head of state and the first foreign minister to visit China after June 4th were both from Africa.
Wow, that's significant.
It profoundly transformed the relationship. It solidified this sense of, like, enduring gratitude within Beijing.
A real debt, politically speaking.
Definitely. And it's no coincidence that since 1991, as this kind of token of gratitude, this symbolic gesture of how important the continent was, China's foreign ministers have consistently made Africa their very first international stop each new year.
Every single year. That says a lot.
It really does. Speaks volumes about the depth of this post-Tiananmen shift.
Hmm.
So this period, starting in the early 90s, it genuinely marked a huge, lasting policy shift. China's new way of dealing with Africa was now explicitly described as flexible, differentiated, and proactive.
More buzzwords, but they signaled real change.
And it wasn't just high-level diplomatic stuff or symbolic visits anymore. It quickly turned into concrete, on-the-ground collaborations across different sectors.
Practical partnerships started popping up.
Yeah, we began to see these initial joint ventures, practical partnerships emerging all over the continent,
Yeah.
often focused on things like processing raw materials, setting up light assembly plants,
Huh?
technical projects that kind of mirrored China's own early development stages.
Like cacao in Côte d'Ivoire.
Exactly. Cacao in Côte d'Ivoire, plate glass manufacturing in Kenya, iron extraction cooperation in Zimbabwe.
An investment center in Mali, I remember reading.
Yep, an investment and development trade center there. And even the first Chinese bank opening in Zambia. That was notable too.
So a real flurry of activity.
Absolutely. It was this clear, unmistakable signal. China now saw Africa not just as a political ally, but as an indispensable economic partner in its new post-isolation global strategy.
A calculated move. Recognizing Africa's diplomatic weight, yes, but also its growing economic potential.
Precisely. Laying the groundwork for the massive engagement we see unfolding today.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these contrasting approaches, China's evolving model versus the, let's say, established Western one, really set the ideological and practical stage for so much of the current discussion around China's role in Africa.
Yeah, the whole Washington consensus versus Beijing consensus debate.
Exactly. For decades, especially the 80s and 90s, African nations were heavily influenced, often constrained by the Washington consensus.
Promoted by the IMF, World Bank.
Right. These powerful institutions. And it wasn't just ideas, it was a package of free market policies.
Often with very strict conditions attached to loans and aid, right?
Extremely stringent conditions, widespread privatization, deregulation, cuts in government spending, often forcing painful austerity measures.
And the impact.
Well, in practice, for many African countries, this approach often led to severe harm for their, young, vulnerable industries. It forced them to open up their markets way too quickly.
Before they were ready for that global competition.
Precisely. Stifling local manufacturing, farming, just overall industrialization efforts. Many African leaders saw it as, frankly, an infringement on their national sovereignty.
And the outcomes weren't always growth, were they?
Often economically destabilizing rather than empowering.
So then comes the alternative.
The Beijing Consensus, as it's often called. And this approach holds immense appeal for many African countries precisely because it offers a compelling alternative to those often painful conditions and ideological demands of the Washington model.
What are the key differences?
Well, the Beijing Consensus generally advocates for more government involvement in the economy, allowing the state to play a more direct guiding role in strategic planning, industrial development, big infrastructure projects. And crucially, this is a major differentiator. It typically comes with far fewer loan conditions.
No strings attached appeal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Highly attractive to countries that felt stifled by external dictates, viewing them as, relics of colonialism or just undermining their national autonomy.
And when China invests or builds things, railways, ports, power plants.
It often brings its own technology, its own companies, and, a significant chunk of its own labor force.
Which can be controversial regarding local jobs.
It can be, definitely. But from the perspective of many African governments, it means projects get done efficiently, often really quickly and critically, without that ideological baggage or those demanding policy changes tied to Western aid. It's seen as more pragmatic, more results-focused.
A partnership based on getting things built.
Pretty much. And it's particularly important to flag one specific aspect here. A defining feature of the Beijing Consensus in Africa is that it generally doesn't include explicit technology transfer as a condition.
Ah, that's huge, unlike some Western models.
Exactly. Western development models sometimes link aid or investment to capacity building, direct knowledge transfer to local people. China's approach is often different in that regard.
So, state-led development, fewer conditions, bringing their own tech and labor.
All of it. This difference in approach has fundamentally reshaped the choices available to African nations. It's given them a new pathway, one many leaders find more aligned with their desire for rapid development and modernization, but without what they see as undue external interference.
Sovereignty and speed, perhaps.
It's a pragmatic offer, really, a clear alternative in the global development landscape.
That really does set a crucial stage, historically and ideologically, for understanding why China engages the way it does. And here's where it gets really interesting, because these aren't just abstract ideas or theories, are they?
No, they translate directly into action.
Into very concrete strategic actions that underpin China's massive, rapidly growing presence across Africa. When we really dig into China's foreign policy there, we can boil it down to four main interconnected interests. They're like pillars holding up this huge engagement.
Political, economic, security, and ideological.
Exactly. Political, economic, security, and ideological. Each one plays a distinct but linked role in shaping Beijing's overall strategy for the continent.
Absolutely. And maybe we should dive deeper into those political interests first, because
Yeah.
they really are foundational.
Sounds good. Lay it out for us.
Okay, so historically, China's main goal in Africa was pretty straightforward, very pragmatic: gain diplomatic recognition from as many countries as possible.
Why was that so important?
To bolster the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its regime on the world stage, think back to the 1960s, a really turbulent time when China was, as they put it, striking with both fists, challenging both the US and the Soviet Union.
Right, they were quite isolated then, too.
Very. So their strong support for newly independent African countries significantly eased that pressure of global isolation. It built this deep emotional attachment, a real sense of solidarity with these new nations.
And that goodwill lasted.
It absolutely has. It's remained this consistent, powerful thread woven through the relationship, a reservoir of goodwill Beijing still taps into today.
Beyond just recognition, what else?
Well, China has consistently and substantially relied on the diplomatic support and, crucially, the votes from African countries on critical issues, especially in places like the United Nations.
The numbers game?
Exactly. Consider the sheer strength. The 54 African countries collectively hold over a quarter of all UN member states and votes. That's invaluable diplomatic muscle for Beijing.
Any key examples?
Oh, a pivotal one, which really cemented Africa's political value in Beijing's eyes, was 1972. That year, 26 African nations, over a third of the total votes in favor, voted for the People's Republic of China to reclaim its seat at the UN, kicking out Taiwan.
Wow, 26 African votes. That's decisive.
It was a total game changer, an act of solidarity that Beijing has never forgotten.
And does that pattern still hold today?
Absolutely. China consistently relies on African backing for sensitive issues, things touching its core national interests. Take 2008, just before the Beijing Olympics. The whole Tibet issue flared up at the UN Human Rights Council.
Right, that was contentious.
Extremely. China leaned heavily on African countries to either stay quiet or, even better, issue statements supporting China's position. It helped diffuse hostile comments from the West.
So, ongoing support on human rights, UN reform.
Exactly. That diplomatic alignment with such a significant bloc gives Beijing a crucial international shield and really amplifies its voice globally. It underpins its legitimacy.
And then there's the whole Taiwan issue.
Ah, yes, the one China policy. That's another core political goal. It's been this persistent tug of war for over 6 decades, ever since the PRC was formed. Ending Taiwan's diplomatic presence on the continent is non-negotiable for Beijing.
Why is it so critical?
For Beijing, getting the world to adopt the one China policy, recognizing Beijing, not Taipei, as China's sole legal representative, isn't just diplomacy. It's fundamental regime legitimacy. National unity.
And Taiwan fought back with checkbook diplomacy.
Historically, yes. Taiwan used financial incentives, loans, to try and keep its few remaining African allies. You saw examples like São Tomé and Príncipe getting maybe $30 million, Niger $50 million, Chad a hefty $125 million back in the 90s.
Significant sums for smaller nations.
Absolutely. Taiwan's strategic...
China's resources are just vast now.
Precisely. Armed with its huge and growing financial clout, China has been steadily winning this diplomatic battle, systematically pushing Taiwan out of Africa.
How many allies does Taiwan have left there now? Or back when this source data was compiled?
As of the time our sources were looking at this, it was down to just three: Burkina Faso, Eswatini, which used to be Swaziland, and São Tomé and Príncipe.
That's a dramatic reduction.
It really is. And you see examples like the Gambia, which cut ties with Taiwan in 2013, showing how effective Beijing's strategy was. Though, interestingly, the Gambia didn't manage to reestablish ties with Beijing immediately, showing it's a complex game.
But the overall trend is clear.
Unmistakable. This relentless pursuit of the one China policy across Africa just underscores how vital diplomatic recognition and global legitimacy are to Beijing's whole political agenda on the continent. It's a long game, and China's playing to win.
And it's absolutely clear that it's not just about the politics, right? The economic interests are incredibly powerful. Maybe even the main engine driving the sheer scale of China's engagement now.
I think that's fair to say. The economic drivers are immense.
After 1979, China's foreign policy went through this fundamental shift. It moved away from primarily giving political
To
assistance
fellow developing nations, yeah.
and moved squarely, pragmatically, towards mutually advantageous economic cooperation.
That phrase says it all. Mutual advantage, but definitely advantageous for China.
And it wasn't just words. It meant shifting from direct aid to actively boosting service contracts, investment, and commerce across Africa.
A direct reflection of their domestic strategy too, right? Diversify the economy, deliver economic progress at home to shore up political legitimacy.
Exactly. This new economic philosophy, focused on utilizing both home and international markets and resources, really gained steam in the mid-90s.
Wasn't that when Jiang Zemin introduced the going out strategy?
Spot on. After touring 6 African countries in '96, then President Jiang Zemin officially introduced it. This policy was all about encouraging Chinese companies to invest abroad, find new markets, secure resources.
And it spurred a massive boom in China's foreign economic activity.
Huge. It was formally approved as a national strategy by the Politburo in 2000 and has been a central driver of China's global expansion ever since.
So why Africa? Why was it such an ideal fit for this going out plan?
Several really compelling reasons. First, and maybe more easily, resources. The continent has abundant energy reserves, vast mineral deposits, tons of other raw materials.
Fueling China's insatiable demand.
Exactly. Directly feeding China's own domestic economic growth and tackling its growing internal resource depletion. By the early 2000s, China had tons of foreign cash reserves, but it was hitting a bottleneck. Domestic energy and raw materials just weren't keeping up with industrial output.
Africa offered a solution, an accessible one.
Yep. Second reason, relationships. China's active cultivation of African countries earlier on, especially post-Tiananmen, meant it had comparatively favorable relationships there.
Less political baggage compared to other regions.
Right, fewer hurdles, a more welcoming environment for big investments in commerce compared to, say, problematic states elsewhere.
Okay, so resources, relationships,
Right.
What else?
Market opportunities. China was also keenly looking at Africa as a huge potential market.
For all those low-cost manufactured goods?
Exactly. Chinese companies have this massive advantage in producing high volumes of cheap textiles, electronics, just a massive range of products.
Yeah.
And that output perfectly meets the growing demands of developing African economies.
A huge consumer base for Chinese goods, creating that supply-demand match.
Though, as we'll discuss, the terms of trade often favor the industrial power and the importance of Africa as a market. It grew even more dramatically after the 2008 global financial crisis.
Ah, right. Western demand plummeted.
Exactly. The crisis hit China's export sectors hard. Demand in the West just dried up. So China's export industries had to aggressively look for new, underserved markets to fill that huge gap.
And Africa was right there.
Right there. It's no coincidence that China dramatically overtook the U.S. as Africa's largest trading partner right around that time. The crisis was a catalyst. It solidified Africa's role as this indispensable outlet for Chinese industrial output.
Interesting. And there's one more piece, isn't there, about moving up the value chain?
Yes, absolutely. As China tries to modernize its own economy, climb that global supply chain, Africa has been pinpointed as an ideal destination for China's more labor-intensive industries.
Offshoring the lower-skilled jobs.
Pretty much. Africa has vast, largely untapped labor resources. It provides a convenient place to relocate manufacturing processes that don't really fit China's evolving economic structure anymore.
So, by moving those jobs to Africa,
China frees up its domestic economy to focus on developing more capital-intensive, high-tech sectors, creating higher-skilled, higher-wage jobs at home.
it's a calculated move,
Yeah.
using Africa as a stepping stone in its own economic transformation, elevating the sophistication of its own economy.
Exactly, a very strategic, multi-layered economic interest.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit then to the security interests. Now, you mentioned earlier Africa's geographical distance means it's not really a direct physical threat to China's immediate national security, its borders.
Right, the concerns are different.
The nature of China's security concerns in Africa is primarily defensive. It's focused on protecting its rapidly expanding commercial footprint.
But as that footprint gets bigger,
Exactly. As China's economic activity has just exploded, and as the sheer number of its citizens living and working across Africa has grown so incredibly fast, the physical security of Chinese investments, everything from huge railways and dams down to individual mining sites, and crucially, the safety of its citizens has become Beijing's most pressing, immediate security concern.
do we have numbers on how many Chinese citizens are there?
The sources we looked at indicated that as of October 2012, there were at least 1 million Chinese individuals living in Africa.
1 million, that's a huge presence.
It is, and this massive presence spread across many countries, often in remote, resource-rich areas, combined with the often, let's say, tumultuous political situations, local conflicts, and general security challenges in parts of Africa, it means these people and their investments face severe, real security dangers, both locally and nationally.
So not abstract risks, but tangible threats.
Very tangible. Think about potential kidnappings of Chinese workers, especially in volatile mining regions. Think about how civil unrest or political instability can impact major Chinese finance infrastructure projects, big financial losses, major delays.
Piracy affecting shipping lanes, too.
That's another one. Those lanes are vital for getting African resources back to China, or even just protecting Chinese businesses from crime in cities.
So Beijing's aware of this growing liability.
Acutely aware, this growing footprint in potentially unstable places requires a robust, multifaceted approach to protect its interests and its people.
Is this about traditional military projection bases?
Not primarily, no. It's more about safeguarding the tangible results of its economic and political going-out strategy. They use a mix of diplomacy, security partnerships, and increasingly relying on private security firms to keep personnel and assets safe.
So economic expansion brings security headaches.
Inherent and escalating security liabilities that China simply has to address.
Okay, that covers security. Now, rounding out these four pillars, we get to the ideological interests. And you mentioned these have taken on a new, kind of more subtle form.
That's right. It's not like the old Cold War days.
Right. Historically, especially during the Cold War and before China really opened up, ideology was actually a major driver, maybe the major driver of its Africa policy.
Yeah, China positioned itself as the leader of the developing world. Anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism.
Anti-revisionism, the critique aimed at the Soviets.
Right. This strong emphasis on a shared anti-imperialist ideology came directly from China's need to find friendly diplomatic space, just ensure its own existence in what it saw as a hostile world dominated by the West and the Soviet bloc.
And they actually contributed tangibly back then, despite their own struggles.
They did,
Yeah.
supporting African liberation movements, some early development projects, but that overt ideological push largely vanished after 1979. Pragmatism took over.
So what replaced it?
Well, since that shift, China made a very deliberate choice. It mostly stopped using explicit ideology, communism, socialism, capitalism in its dealings with African countries. The focus became establishing broad, practical ties with any African nation that simply supported the One China policy.
Driven by economics and practical politics.
Exactly. Getting international sympathizers, boosting global legitimacy post-Cold War. The old revolutionary talk got shelved for more transactional relationships.
But here's where it gets interesting, you said. The ideology didn't vanish. It just changed shape.
Precisely. It transformed into something far more subtle but still powerful. Today, this ideological interest shows up mainly in the strategic promotion and popularization of China's growth model.
Showcasing their unique approach to development.
Exactly. Strong state guidance, rapid infrastructure, economic growth without Western-style political liberalization. The idea is to promote this model globally, thereby boosting Beijing's own political legitimacy.
What's the logic there?
It's pretty simple and pragmatic. The more countries that identify with, understand, maybe even try to copy Beijing's approach to growth and governance, the less isolated China feels internationally. It helps create a global environment that's more accepting of its own political system.
And this extends to supporting certain types of governments in Africa.
Yes, Beijing openly wants to see non-Western, non-democratic governments succeed in Africa. Think Sudan, Zimbabwe, the DRC, for example, according to the sources.
Why specifically those?
The thinking is deeply strategic. The success of regimes like those serves as tangible proof that Western-style democracy isn't a universal value, not the only path to development. It suggests alternative systems can also deliver progress, stability.
Which in turn makes China's own system look more viable.
Exactly. It reduces China's international isolation, makes its own authoritarian system seem more legitimate globally. So any perceived success by authoritarian governments in Africa is seen, implicitly and directly, as supporting the legitimacy and standing of the Chinese Communist Party itself.
So what does this all mean for the bigger picture of global development?
It suggests this complex mix, doesn't it? Pragmatic interests, economic, security, all tangled up with this subtle but very significant ideological push for a non-Western model of progress, a model that inherently validates China's own path.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
Indeed. And to really grasp the full implications of all these multifaceted Chinese interests, especially for a specific country like Nigeria, it's absolutely vital we anchor this discussion in some kind of theoretical framework.
Okay, where do we start?
Well, this whole study of China's policy in Africa and its impact on Nigeria is incredibly well illuminated by dependency theory.
Dependency theory.
This theory, first really articulated by Dos Santos back in 1970, gives us a powerful, often quite stark lens to view these complex asymmetrical relationships between nations.
How did Dos Santos define it?
He defined dependency as, and I'm quoting loosely here, a scenario where the economic development of one economy is conditioned by the development and expansion of another economy to which the first one is subjected.
Okay, that's a bit dense. Break it down.
The core idea is profound. When some countries, the dominant industrialized ones, can expand and be pretty self-sustaining, other countries, the dependent ones, can often only grow as a reflection of that expansion.
A reflection.
Yeah.
Meaning it's not their own engine driving growth.
Exactly. And that reflection isn't always positive. It can be beneficial sometimes, sure, but more often it can have negative effects on their immediate and long-term development. It's about interdependence, yes, but the power dynamics are fundamentally unequal, favoring the dominant partner.
And others built on this idea. Nkrumah.
Right. Nkrumah, way back in '68, introduced the concept of neocolonialism. Chillingly relevant.
How did he describe it?
A situation where a state is officially independent, sovereign, it's thrown off the colonial chains. Yet its economic system, and therefore its political philosophy, its policy choices, remain fundamentally controlled by a former colonial power, or maybe a new, powerful external entity.
And dependency theory adds another layer.
Yes, it adds the idea of peripherality, or satellite status, as Smith described it in '96. This paints a pretty grim picture where relations between developing and developed countries often see the expansion of the dominant nations having mostly negative consequences for the dependent ones' economies and their ability to achieve self-sustaining growth. They basically become economic satellites orbiting a more powerful center.
Sounds quite deterministic.
Some versions are. Andre Gunder Frank, a very prominent, often provocative dependency theorist, took it even further.
What did he argue?
He famously argued that development and underdevelopment aren't separate things. They're two sides of the same coin.
Meaning one causes the other?
Essentially, yes. He argued, quite starkly, that the industrialized world's development was, and continues to be, made possible only by the third world's equivalent underdevelopment.
That's a strong claim.
It is. He powerfully stated, no country that has been securely linked to the metropolis as a satellite through inclusion into the world capitalist system has earned the rank of an economically developed country. It implies that for a dependent nation, real self-sustaining development might be fundamentally blocked by the very nature of its relationship with a dominant global power.
So the system itself creates the inequality.
That's the argument. And according to Wilbur in 1973, the biggest, most enduring challenge for third world economies was precisely this unequal integration into the international economic system.
And this has roots in colonialism.
Deep roots. During the colonial era, economic policies in the colonies were explicitly designed to serve the mother country, providing raw materials, buying finished goods.
Right.
After independence, tragically, many former colonies continued this pattern of asymmetrical dependence. They primarily exchanged raw materials, agricultural products, fuel like Nigeria's oil, for finished manufactured goods, capital, and technology from the industrialized nations.
Which perpetuates a structural disadvantage.
Yeah.
Makes it hard to diversify, build their own industries.
Exactly. And the relevance of all this theory to our deep dive on Nigeria is just immediately profoundly obvious.
How so?
Nigeria is blessed with abundant natural resources, especially crude oil, over 90% of its foreign profits, as our sources note. A classic resource-rich nation. Yet, at the same time, Nigeria is highly dependent on China for most of its finished goods. Electronics, textiles, industrial machinery, you name it.
So, exporting raw materials, importing manufactured goods.
It fits the dependency model perfectly, it echoes that colonial legacy, and it raises critical, uncomfortable questions. Does this relationship, despite the huge trade volume, truly foster self-sustaining, diversified development for Nigeria?
Or does it inadvertently keep Nigeria reliant on external powers?
Exactly. Hindering its ability to develop its own industrial and technological capabilities, trapping it in that cycle of underdevelopment as a satellite economy.
So high trade volume doesn't automatically mean equitable development.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Dependency theory gives us a powerful, though, yes, sobering framework for understanding these dynamics and the potential long-term implications for Nigeria's development path.
That framework really does help clarify the underlying power dynamics, doesn't it? Okay, so now that we've got a handle on China's motivations and this theoretical lens, let's pivot. Let's move from the grand strategy to the realities on the ground in Nigeria.
Right, because despite the promises and the huge engagement, some really significant challenges have emerged.
Yeah, challenges that fundamentally inhibit the realization of genuinely positive, equitable outcomes from China's policy in Nigeria. These are the friction points, the places where you see the real human and economic costs.
Indeed. And one of the most glaring, most persistent issues is the inherent and actually worsening imbalance in the trade structure between Nigeria and China.
The trade numbers looked huge initially.
They did. Since they signed that trade and investment agreement back in 2000, bilateral trade just exploded. Reached what? USD 17.7 billion in 2010, nearly a tenfold increase in a decade.
Which sounds great on the surface, a thriving partnership.
Exactly. But when you dig deeper, look at the data more closely, it reveals this rapidly worsening, fundamentally lopsided imbalance.
How so?
Well, while Nigeria's exports to China certainly more than doubled in that period, which sounds good, they just didn't keep pace with the truly exponential surge in Chinese exports to Nigeria.
Okay, give us the numbers.
To put it starkly, Chinese exports were about 66.7% of the total bilateral trade in 2000. By 2010, that figure had soared dramatically to 87.3%.
Wow, from 2/3 to nearly 7/8.
Think about it. In just a decade, for every dollar Nigeria earned from trade with China, China was earning nearly $7 back from Nigeria. Correction based on 87.3% figure means China gets 87.3 cents for every 12.7 cents Nigeria gets, roughly 7.1 ratio. That's not just lopsided, it's a structural trap.
Shaping Nigeria's whole economic future.
Absolutely. By 2010, Nigeria was China's fourth largest African trading partner and the continent's second largest destination for Chinese exports. But the relationship overwhelmingly and increasingly favored China.
And what is Nigeria exporting versus importing?
That composition highlights the imbalance even more. Nigeria's exports to China, almost exclusively primary commodities, mostly crude oil again, over 90% of foreign profits, plus other raw stuff like timber, minerals, some agricultural products.
And imports from China.
Predominantly manufactured items, everything from basic consumer goods, electronics, clothes, to more complex capital goods for infrastructure projects.
So it perpetuates that classic dependency model. Raw materials out, finished goods in.
Exactly, echoing the colonial legacy. Take 2014 data, for example. Nigeria exported about $4.6 billion to China, mostly oil. China exported a staggering $9.6 billion to Nigeria in the same year.
That's a huge gap. More than double.
A consistent, significant gap. A severe, growing trade deficit for Nigeria. It reinforces the idea that despite high trade volume, the benefits are far from equal.
And this imbalance makes it harder for Nigeria, too.
To diversify its economy, to industrialize, to move beyond that debilitating reliance on raw material exports. It keeps Nigeria trapped in a lower value-added position in the global economy.
Okay. Building on that trade imbalance, there's another big friction point, right? Something Nigeria desperately needs to overcome for real development.
Yes, the stark imbalance in technological transfer.
Nigeria struggled with a lack of advanced technical expertise for a long time. It's held back its global competitiveness.
Definitely. So China, with its rapid advancements, its huge industrial capacity, often looked like a potentially valuable technology partner,
Right.
a source for the know-how Nigeria lacked.
But the reality,
Well, there's been considerable mounting criticism that the actual technology transferred through Chinese foreign direct investment, FDI, is in fact negligible.
negligible. Why is that?
The main reason our sources cite is that most Chinese companies, when they set up in Nigeria, tend to bring in the entire equipment with Chinese personnel to install it, operate it, maintain it.
Ah, so they bring the whole package. They don't train locals on the core stuff.
Largely, no. Instead of genuinely transferring core tech knowledge, vital operational know-how, or building deep local expertise among Nigerian workers, the processes, the skilled labor, remain mostly confined within the Chinese framework.
Which limits local capacity building, keeps Nigeria reliant on foreign help.
Severely limits it, perpetuates reliance rather than fostering indigenous capabilities.
Is there a specific example of this?
A really clear, troubling illustration comes from Zamfara State. The state government was excited about a $250 million joint venture with Chinese firms for processing and smelting plants for solid minerals, a key sector.
Okay, how is it structured?
The Chinese businesses held 90% ownership. Zamfara government just 10%.
90-10, okay? And the division of labor.
Stark. The Chinese companies were solely responsible for designing the projects, choosing the tech, buying all the equipment from Chinese suppliers, naturally installing it, and then crucially, operating these complex plants.
And what did Nigeria provide?
The Zamfara government provided the land, got the licenses, offered security for the investment, and employed 5,000 local miners for the manual labor.
5,000 jobs sounds good.
Yeah. But the fundamental element missing is the transfer of core technology, the training that leads to Nigerian technical and managerial expertise, the long-term ability for Nigeria to replicate or improve these processes independently.
So the key knowledge stayed with the Chinese partners.
Exactly. The intellectual property, the high-value processes, it perpetuated reliance rather than truly fostering Nigeria's own self-sufficiency and industrial advancement in these critical sectors.
It's jobs, but maybe not genuine empowerment.
That's a good way to phrase it. A classic case.
And that lack of real tech transfer, it seems to feed into another deep concern, described as China's exploitative tendency, even economic sabotage sometimes.
Unfortunately, yes. It feeds directly into that. It's a really complex picture on the ground because Chinese investments often spark these intensely contradictory feelings in Nigeria, right?
Yeah, suspicion of neocolonialism versus praise for the visible infrastructure.
Exactly. But a significant recurring concern is that these investments often get undue privileges from local authorities, while at the same time flouting existing operational guidelines and prevailing business principles by hook or crook.
Flouting, meaning openly disregarding rules, using illicit means.
Pretty much. Intentionally circumventing established rules, ethical practices, often through shady means, just to get things done their way. It suggests a systemic disregard for local regulations, a willingness to operate outside the lines.
And the driver is that huge resource demand.
That's clearly a huge part of it. China's rapid growth fuels this enormous, relentless demand for natural resources. Copper from Africa for manufacturing, electronics, oil, of course, feeding that huge industrial machine.
For furniture, wood, pharmaceuticals, computers, transport, textiles.
Everything. This resource extraction is a massive, non-negotiable part of their engagement.
Yet there's this paradox you mentioned, that despite billions invested, it might actually be contributing to unemployment.
Right.
It's troubling.
China's economic support, according to our sources, is paradoxically contributing to growing unemployment and wreaking havoc on job growth in Nigeria.
How does that work?
It points to a fundamental disconnect. There's capital inflow, visible projects, yes, but it's not necessarily translating into sustainable, broad-based local employment or the kind of industrial development that truly empowers the Nigerian workforce to create its own wealth.
So the argument is China's sometimes abandoning its promises of positive change.
That's what some sources suggest. That amidst the big investments in infrastructure, the pledge to bring tangible, positive change gets lost. The investment doesn't always lead to real local economic upliftment.
And there were examples of unlawful ways being used.
Yes, our sources indicate that. For instance, Nigerian law reserves mining on small plots, less than 25 acres, specifically for Nigerian natives. It's meant to protect local livelihoods, small businesses. Yet, reports suggest Chinese companies are engaged in mining on these plots, operating illegally. Similarly, prospecting for gold or other valuable stones with local landowners, also unlawful under Nigerian regulations, apparently continues.
So bypassing legal frameworks, undermining the rule of law.
And potentially siphoning off revenue that should be fueling legitimate local development. It's this subtle but pervasive economic leakage where profits from Nigeria's own resources bypass the proper channels.
Wow. Okay, so trade imbalance, lack of tech transfer, exploitative practices, and then there's the whole issue of substandard products.
Oh, yes, the dumping issue.
Our sources say China has been consistently dumping inferior goods in Nigeria, creating another huge challenge for consumers and local industries.
It's a multi-layered problem, absolutely, and the scale seems quite stark. One Nigerian official cited in our material estimated that as much as 80% of the fake items that come into Nigeria are originating from Asia, with China as the real guilty party.
Yeah, 80%. That really underlines the argument that China's flooding the market with shoddy, maybe unsafe goods, undercutting any local attempt at quality production.
It stifles Nigerian producers trying to compete.
But what's really complex here, almost uncomfortable, was the element of Nigerian collusion, right?
That's a crucial and, uncomfortable part of the picture. Our sources note it's often Nigerian businessmen themselves who made specifications for such inferior but profitable goods for their market.
So they're asking for the cheap, low-quality stuff, not the high-quality Chinese products sold elsewhere, like Europe or the U.S.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
It implies this complex, almost symbiotic dynamic where a segment of local demand driven by the desire for cheapness, even if it's notoriously low quality, directly helps perpetuate the problem.
Some sources even mention Nigerian criminals flying to China to arrange this.
That's what was suggested, yeah. Bypassing official channels to specifically source these questionable items. So it's not just China unilaterally forcing bad products on the market. There's this reciprocal element driven by market demand for low prices and opportunistic, sometimes illicit behavior on both sides.
Almost like buyer beware on a massive scale. Price over quality.
Where the allure of a low price often overrides concerns about quality or the long-term economic hit.
And smuggling makes it even harder to control.
Much worse. A significant chunk of these goods enters Nigeria through informal trade, widespread smuggling, especially from neighbors like Benin and Cameroon. It makes it incredibly difficult for Nigerian authorities to control the influx, enforce any quality standards.
How big is informal trade in the region?
It's inherently hard to quantify, being illicit, but estimates suggest it's a substantial part of overall West African commerce, an almost unmanageable flood of unregulated goods.
So what does this all mean for Nigeria's ability to actually develop its own industries?
It means that even if a local industry could make a quality product, it often has to compete with this relentless flood of cheaper, inferior alternatives maybe smuggled in, undermining its viability, stifling domestic growth before it can even get started.
Makes the path to industrial self-sufficiency incredibly steep.
Extremely steep.
Okay, so these friction points, trade, tech, exploitation, substandard goods, they obviously translate into direct impacts on Nigeria's development. Let's talk about labor practices first.
Right, because this directly affects Nigerian people. While it's true Chinese firms in Nigeria employ a lot of locals, the figure cited was more than 84% local labor.
Which sounds high.
It does, but here's the crucial, deeply concerning caveat.
All right.
Few of these employees are technical or managerial staffs.
So lots of jobs, but mostly low-skilled.
Overwhelmingly. Manual labor positions, mostly. So the chances for Nigerian workers to gain higher-level technical skills, specialized knowledge, valuable management experience, severely limited.
Creating a workforce stuck in basic labor roles. No real pathway up.
Which doesn't really underpin long-term industrial development, does it?
And this leads to dissatisfaction, complaints.
Predictably, yes. Considerable dissatisfaction, resentment, Frequent, widely reported complaints about tough working conditions, perceived mistreatment by Chinese employers, a lack of respect for local customs or labor rights.
Do they comply with local laws, international standards?
Some sources suggest conditions in certain Chinese-owned industries don't comply with Nigerian labor laws or even ILO standards. And there have been tragic incidents highlighting these serious concerns.
Like the factory fire.
Exactly. In 2002, Nigerian workers died trapped inside a locked Chinese-owned factory that caught fire. They couldn't escape.
Horrific. Underscores issues beyond just skills, basic safety rights, dignity.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to that critical question. Is employment without meaningful skills transfer true empowering development?
If most local hires are stuck in low-skilled roles with no clear path to advanced training or management,
It fundamentally limits a country's ability to build its own industrial capacity, truly empower its workforce. It creates jobs, sure, but maybe not the kind that fosters long-term self-sustaining economic growth and national capability.
and the devastating effects of this whole dynamic are felt really sharply in Nigeria's traditional industries, aren't they? Leading to significant industrial displacement, the textile industry being the prime example.
Oh, absolutely. The decline of Nigeria's once vibrant textile industry is perhaps the starkest illustration.
Historically, Nigeria used protectionism, right? Tariffs, import licenses, trying to shield its own industry.
Yes, a deliberate strategy to foster local growth, create jobs.
But then came that big shift in global trade policy.
The pivotal shift in 2004, the WTO transitioned from the multi-fiber arrangement to the Agreement on Textiles and Clothing. This basically opened up international trade in textiles and garments much more, breaking down those protective barriers.
And the consequence for Nigeria.
Immediate and devastating. Starting almost right away in 2005, there was a boom in foreign textile imports, and the vast majority of these new, cheaper imports were Chinese.
How bad was the impact on Nigeria's domestic sector?
Catastrophic, contributing to its virtual extinction in a pretty short time. The numbers are chilling. By early 2005, just after that WTO change, 65 textile mills had closed.
65 mills. And the job losses.
A heartbreaking 150,000 workers lost their jobs. Their livelihoods just vanished almost overnight, especially in historical hubs like Kaduna and Kano.
Once centers of Nigerian industrial pride.
Exactly. By 2012, if you went to Kano's Kantian Quarry Market, once thriving with local production, the overwhelming majority of fabric was Chinese. Maybe some secondhand European clothes, but mostly Chinese goods flooding the market.
And smuggling made it worse.
Compounded the problem. Both Chinese and Nigerian traders smuggling goods in, making it incredibly hard for the government to regulate or protect local producers.
Didn't Nigeria have an import ban on textiles at some point?
It did, but controversially, that ban was lifted in 2010, which only seemed to accelerate the decline, opening the floodgates even wider.
How did people react to all this? Must have been varied.
Deeply varied, really reveals the raw complexity. Predictably, the Nigerian textile companies, the thousands of workers, profoundly dissatisfied. They blame the closures, the job losses, directly on the illegal import of cheap, often poor-quality Chinese textiles through Nigeria's porous borders.
Even if they acknowledge Nigerian traders are involved too.
Right. The overall feeling is deep resentment towards this overwhelming influx. But on the other hand, many Nigerian cloth traders, the ones selling the fabrics, they were reportedly thrilled.
Thrilled? Why?
For them, it meant direct access to much cheaper goods from China, much faster turnaround times on orders, quicker profits, less overhead compared to local production.
So what does this all mean for Nigeria's ability to actually develop its own industries?
It means this perfect storm global trade changes, a flood of cheaper foreign goods. A domestic market, sometimes choosing price over quality, has collectively just decimated a once vibrant, job-rich sector, making the path to genuine industrial self-sufficiency incredibly challenging, if not impossible, in that industry.
And this issue connects to intellectual property too, right?
Yeah.
Particularly in textiles.
Yes. This issue of designs disappearing without authorization, especially in textiles, leads us straight to another significant, frustrating impact: the persistent challenge of intellectual property rights, a topic, our sources say, that's regularly brought up.
What's the core problem there?
Well, particularly in creative industries like textiles, it's quite illustrative. Nigerian designers or traders often send their unique design ideas to potential production partners in China.
How? Informally, like a photo.
Often, yeah. Maybe just snapping a picture of a new fabric pattern on their phone, sending it via WhatsApp or something to get production bids from Chinese manufacturers.
Okay.
The deeply troubling, often repeated outcome is that these unique, locally conceived designs frequently appear elsewhere without authorization.
Meaning they get copied.
Exactly. The original Nigerian designers lose control. Their innovative ideas get replicated, maybe slightly altered, then mass-produced and sold by others, often way cheaper, with no compensation, credit, or license back to the original creators.
An immediate loss of creative value, economic
It's
opportunity.
totally an erosion.
And this isn't just textiles.
No, this concern isn't limited to textiles. The sentiment is widely echoed by some Nigerian partners of Chinese firms in Nigeria's free trade zones, FTZs, other manufacturing ventures too. It suggests a broader pattern where local innovation, unique designs, intellectual property are just highly vulnerable in these international supply chains.
Especially when dealing with manufacturers abroad who maybe don't respect those rights.
Right, and what's fascinating here is how these global supply chains, while offering efficiencies and lower costs, can inadvertently make it so hard to protect local innovation.
Stifling a nation's ability to develop its own unique products, build brands, compete on originality.
Precisely. If Nigerian designers and businesses can't effectively protect their original creations, it kills a key incentive for local innovation, long-term growth. Why bother designing something new if it can just be copied and sold back to your own market by a foreign competitor?
It hinders that move towards a knowledge-based economy, sustainable industries.
Definitely. It keeps the cycle going.
Okay, we've covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive, just peeled back layer after layer of this really complex, evolving, often contentious relationship. Let's try to synthesize these findings now, get the bigger picture.
Sounds good. Bring it together.
We've explored China's strategic interests, right? The political need for recognition, votes, the insatiable economic demand for resources, markets, the growing security concerns, and that subtle but powerful ideological push for its unique growth model.
Uh-huh. And how that policy evolved dramatically from ideology to stark pragmatism, especially after Tiananmen.
Exactly. Then we really dug into the significant real-world challenges hitting Nigeria. That persistent, worsening trade imbalance, heavily favoring China.
The concerning lack of meaningful technology transfer to empower Nigerian industry.
Widespread issues around exploitative practices, the flouting of local norms by some Chinese companies, and that pervasive influx of substandard goods, crippling local production, harming consumers.
Hmm.
And finally, we saw the direct, tangible effects on Nigeria's development. From those problematic labor practices, lots of low-skilled jobs, few pathways up to the devastating industrial displacement, especially in textiles,
It's virtual extinction.
and that critical ongoing issue of intellectual property rights being violated, stifling local innovation.
Yeah, you've summed it up well.
So, the core conclusion that seems to emerge really powerfully from this analysis is pretty clear, isn't it? While China's interests in Africa are multifaceted, leading to massive engagement, visible infrastructure, it has not, in fact, resulted in broad-based, self-sustaining development in Nigeria.
Not in the way you'd hope for equitable partnership.
Right. Instead, the relationship, especially viewed through that dependency theory lens, seems fundamentally marked by these deep imbalances, specific challenges that, in many ways, actually perpetuate a form of dependency, rather than genuinely fostering Nigeria's own robust, diversified, self-sufficient growth.
It's a classic case, as you said, of high volume not translating into high value for the African partner.
Exactly.
Exactly. And given these findings, these complex, often asymmetrical dynamics we've uncovered, the analysis does offer several critical recommendations, ideas for how African nations, and Nigeria specifically, can try to proactively navigate this relationship more effectively to foster genuine, equitable, self-sustaining development.
Okay, what's the path forward? It can't be simple.
Not simple at all, but these points offer crucial strategic guidance. Firstly, it's recommended that Africa should proactively take advantage of China's economic, political, and ideological interest.
Not just passively accept, but strategically leverage.
Precisely. It's about being more assertive in negotiations. African nations need to actively encourage China to strengthen and improve its cooperation in other areas such as engineering and technology.
Pushing beyond just resource extraction and basic infrastructure.
Exactly. Demanding more substantive, long-term partnerships. Demanding genuine capacity building, real knowledge transfer in high-value sectors. Ensuring Chinese investments actually help develop a skilled, locally empowered workforce and diversified industries in Africa, not just import all the expertise.
Okay, that's number one. What else?
Secondly, for Nigeria specifically, There needs to be a concerted effort to police its borders to prevent the influx of inferior Chinese goods.
Tackle that dumping and smuggling problem head on.
Yes. As we discussed, these substandard, cheap imports often stifle local industry, undermine quality, create unfair competition, strengthening border controls, investing in a robust regulatory enforcement that would help stop local industries from being swamped,
Give them breathing room to grow, innovate.
create a more level playing field. Which also means tackling the complex domestic factors, corruption, maybe even consumer demand for cheapness that fuel the problem. It's a two-pronged attack.
Right. And the third recommendation.
Finally, a crucial one directly addressing those problematic labor practices and the lack of skills transfer. The Nigerian government should put down strong laws as well as implement the laws that will lead to Chinese firms putting more Nigerians into managerial and technical positions.
So not just laws on the books, but actual enforcement.
Stronger laws and, crucially, implementation. Ensuring local employment in Chinese firms isn't just about headcounts of low-skilled workers. It's about mandating, facilitating meaningful skills and knowledge transfer, ensuring Nigerians have clear pathways to technical and managerial roles.
Building that indigenous capacity, expertise, a truly skilled workforce.
Exactly. Which really raises that important question for all developing nations, doesn't it? How can countries like Nigeria navigate these complex, powerful global relationships to truly foster their own self-sustaining growth rather than staying stuck in dependency?
The path forward requires strategic foresight, strong policy, unwavering enforcement.
To try and tip those scales towards genuine, equitable development.
Wow. Well, the relationship between China and African nations like Nigeria is clearly anything but one-dimensional. It's this rich, often tense mix of strategic interests, huge economic opportunities, and really deep, significant developmental hurdles.
All viewed through that complex lens of history and ongoing global power shifts.
Yeah. It's a partnership that holds both immense promise and, frankly, profound challenges for the continent's future.
Absolutely.
So as global powers keep reshaping alliances, economic flows, development ideas, what responsibilities do both sides have? The dominant nations, like China, and the, let's call them dependent nations for this context, like Nigeria, what responsibility do they both have to ensure these partnerships aren't just transactional, but genuinely equitable? And how can they work together so it leads to sustainable, inclusive development for everyone?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. We hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, plenty to mull over. Maybe sparked some new questions, inspired you to explore more about these critical global dynamics.
Yeah, hopefully it's been insightful.
Definitely a lot to think about.